The current ALEC state chair in my home state of New Mexico introduced legislation at the Roundhouse in recent years called the Transfer of Public Land Act, which would call on the federal government to turn over our public lands over to state management. The only way that Western states like mine could fit the bill for administering America's public lands would be to raise taxes dramatically or, and this is much more likely, sell off large expanses to developers and other private interests. Over time, it would mean that public lands that New Mexicans go to every summer to hike and camp and barbecue with their family, the national forest where they go to chase elk and mule deer during hunting season, would be closed off behind no trespassing signs. I have long believed that public lands are an equalizer in America, where access to public lands ensure that you don't need to be a millionaire to enjoy the great outdoors, or to introduce your family, your children to hunting and fishing and hiking. This land grab idea is just as ludicrous as denying climate change, just as detached from reality, and similarly comes at the expense of our public health and protection of our public lands and resources. Frankly, you don't have to do a deep dive investigation to figure out what's going on here. The so-called policy experts and leaders that make up ALEC's board of directors are on the record as climate skeptics. ALEC's CEO, Lisa Nelson, said, quote, "I don't know the science on that," unquote, when she was asked if CO2 emissions are the primary driver of climate change. Texas State Representative Phil King, the national board chair for ALEC in 2015, said, quote, "I think the global warming theory is bad science," unquote. And Connecticut State Rep John Piscopo, ALEC's national board chairman, in 2013 said that the public has been hoodwinked. I have serious doubts about whether this climate change is man-made. We all know the reason why ALEC's members and leaders say things like this and promote these kinds of bills. It's because so much of the funding for ALEC's operations comes from sources other than membership dues. Over 98% of ALEC's revenues come from corporations and trade groups and corporate foundations. That's how ALEC works, by sowing uninformed seeds of doubt to move the needle at the state and local level towards anti-science, anti-climate action policies that benefit their funders' bottom line. And ALEC is just one piece of a large web of similar dark money organizations that promote climate skepticism and are dangerous fronts for corporate interests to deliberately mislead the public and influence lawmakers. To see just one other recent example of this in my home state of New Mexico, I'd like to take a moment to look at a letter to the editor published last week in the Las Cruces Sun-News by the Environmental Policy Alliance. This is another one of those web of denial political front groups. In the letter to the editor, they claim that conservation and monument designations are really a federal land grab and the works of radical environmental groups trying to stop economic development. These radical groups and green decoys are, according to the letter, such dangerous groups as Trout Unlimited, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, the Isaac Walton League, and Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Groups that all stand up for the interests of sportsmen and hunters and anglers, certainly not what most of my constituents would consider radical. A close look shows that who the real decoy is here. The Environmental Policy Alliance is funded by the Western Fuels Association, another organization in the web of denial. And it's a pet project of lobbyist Rick Berman, who has also led deceptive public campaigns on behalf of cigarette and alcohol companies, and now dirty energy. This organization doesn't care about the best way to manage our publicly owned lands or preserving the ability of Americans, no matter what their stake in life is, how much money they make, to experience our country's rich outdoor heritage. The Environmental Policy Alliance instead wants to put our public lands up for sale so that the corporate elite can develop them for their own use and their own profit. The Environmental Policy Alliance has published similar letters in dozens of small to mid-sized city newspapers all across our country in recent years. Canned letters with no connection to local sentiment. The reality is that the Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument in southern New Mexico, which this group has slandered, serves as a national example of community-driven landscape-scale conservation.